What's up, everyone? Vinny Musso here from Musso Athletics, here for day 7 of our 30 days of force, wrapping up our first week talking about force absorption. So today, a little bit shorter video in terms of the content. Nothing as complex. This first week we've dived pretty deep into some details. Gotten in talking about stuff that happens inside the body. Have talked about different ways to train force absorption. But I'm sure a question that a lot of people might have is, well, okay, well, we have all the information, but how do I kind of throw that in? How do I throw that in to a training program? So today, I kind of wanted to start talking about programming, which we'll talk about, a few more times over the next, the finishing of this 30 days. Talking about it during not only force absorption, but during our force redirection and our force production stages as well. But I want to, kind of preface this video by saying, if you've come here, expecting, me to give you the perfect workout plan, the perfect workout program, there is no perfect plan. I've been the person too. I'm always trying to kind of find, searching for the perfect training program, but unfortunately there is no perfect plan. Different trainers have different ideas of what works best. Different athletes and people who train themselves have different ideas of what works best, excuse me. So to kind of if we're looking for that perfect program, while that doesn't exist, there could be a perfect program out there for each individual person, and that really takes, that's, on a very individualized basis. So as a trainer, you kind of have to play around with, what kind of programming do you find works the best for people. If you're one of those people training yourselves, you kind of have to, again, play around with, what works best for you. It's kind of what I've had to go through as, as an athlete and as a trainer, again, wanting to find that perfect program, just to realize that there is no perfect program. There's just different, ideas and methods that work best for certain people. So, before we dive too deep into the video, I wanted to start with that. That being said, there are definitely a lot of very effective training programs or training templates out there. If you guys remember in our day one video talking about force absorption, I posted in the description principles of triphasic training, as you can see here. So again, triphasic training, trainer named Cal Dietz, very knowledgeable on the subject. So that's one of the methods of training that I subscribe to, just because to me it makes sense. We've talked about that the letter V, as our analogy for how the body absorbs and produces force. I think, even though it sounds, pretty simple, a lot of times, like I mentioned too, simplicity is usually the way to go. Again, a lot of research out there. We see a lot of videos of people doing all these, crazy exercises, crazy programs, but, a lot of times, when it comes down to it, as long as we have the basics, which again can sometimes seem pretty simple, usually that's the best way to go. So, triphasic training or triphasic periodization is a concept that I really subscribe to, and I'll be going into a little bit more detail about how we incorporate our force absorption into that training. This is going to be a quick review for a lot of people. With some people, you might have heard these terms, but you might not be too familiar. I think it's good to know these terms, because they get thrown around a lot in the in the training world, in the rehab world. So if we kind of get an idea of it, it's just going to help us moving forward. Okay, so if we look at the terms here, macrocycle, mesocycle, and microcycle. Like I said, those are ways to kind of describe different phases of a training program. So if we look at macrocycle, the way that I like to think about a macrocycle is macrocycle is kind of like your overall training plan. So if you had a 12-week training program with a 3-month program, that whole outlook of that entire, 12 weeks or that entire 3 months is our macro cycle. So again, under here we have 3 months. So again, using that 12-week program as an example, the macro cycle is the overall view of that entire training program. Okay. That macro cycle can get broken down into further, different divisions or subdivisions. So if we look at mesocycle, okay, that's kind of the breakdown of a macro cycle. So that macro cycle is that entire 3-month plan. We can break that down into mesocycles, which are usually, like 3 to 6 weeks is, the usual length of a mesocycle. Again, that's the breakdown, of the macrocycles into smaller portions. And then those mesocycles can then be divided further into a microcycle, which is usually, a look at your 1-week training program for that week. So our macrocycle can be broken down, from macrocycle all the way down to mesocycle. So to use our triphasic, training as an example of, describing this macro, meso, and microcycle, we can look at our macrocycle again as the overall training plan. So that macrocycle would include our force absorption, force redirection, and then our force production emphasis. So that's our macrocycle. Our mesocycle could be when we're looking individually at each of those different phases of our macrocycle. So for 4 weeks, we are, emphasizing our force absorption. After our 4 weeks of emphasizing our force absorption, then we go into 4 weeks of emphasizing our force redirection. After 4 weeks of that, then we go on into emphasizing 4 weeks of force production. Okay, and then each individual week within that 4-week block, or that 4-week emphasis of each training style, that's our microcycle. So again, your 1 week at a time, plan for the week is your microcycle. So hopefully that makes sense. But one thing I wanted to go into, with that, saying how each of our mesocycles should emphasize a different portion of our force production principles. So again, our first 4 weeks would emphasize force absorption. Our second 4 weeks would emphasize force redirection. Then our last 4 weeks would emphasize force production. The key there, though, is that those different mesocycles, those 4-week increments, it's all about emphasis and not exclusivity. So what I mean by that is when we're in our 4-week mesocycle, starting with our force absorption, we want to emphasize our force absorption training, but we don't want to make it exclusive. So what I mean by that is we don't only want to be working on force absorption exercises. Yes, we want to emphasize it, but we want to also incorporate other parts of our, our training principles in that mesocycle. So you can see down at the bottom here. So let's imagine that this is our 3-month macro cycle working on our force principles, broken into 3 phases, and these 3 phases are our mesocycles. So again, that overall look at the 3 phases is our macro cycle, and each individual phase can be viewed as a mesocycle. So in terms of, again, what we want to emphasize, particularly with force absorption, I like to emphasize it in that first phase, or in that force, in that first mesocycle. So if we're looking here, if we look at all the phases down here, the blocks that I drew here, the block with the lines kind of filling it in, that, we can look at that as our force absorption training. So you can see here in our first phase, our first mesocycle, we have force absorption as that main area of, that main area of emphasis. But again, it's not exclusively force absorption. So yes, we're emphasizing force absorption, and the majority of our training exercises are, done with force absorption in mind. We're still looking at also our force redirection, which could be shown by this middle block, and our force production, which can be shown by this third block here. So again, the point I want to get across is, yes, each individual mesocycle will have a point of emphasis, but it's not exclusive. We want to always be working all concepts of training, all concepts of athleticism It's just a matter of which part is emphasized. So again, for our force absorption concept, which we've been talking about this first third of the 30-day series, in that first phase, we want the majority or the emphasis of our training to be force absorption. So, when I'm training myself or, training, other some of the athletes that I work with, I like to, in that first phase, when we're talking about force absorption, I like to make that a good, 60 to 70% of the overall training. So about 60 to 70% of our exercises are focused on that force absorption concept, again, because that gives us a very good base to work off of moving forward, both for injury prevention and increased athleticism. And then the remaining, 30, 40% or whatever is left is broken up between our force redirection and our force production emphasis. After, we complete our 3 to 4 weeks, again, I like to use that 3 to 4 week mesocycle. I don't like to get too, into the 6 to 8 week. I like to kind of, go short and intense for 3 to 4 weeks. After that 3 to 4 week mesocycle, take a nice week off to deload. In terms of deload, that's a whole other topic, that maybe at the end of this 30 days, I can kind of talk about deload and deloading principles. But after that 3 to 4 weeks of emphasizing our force absorption, then we move on to phase 2, which is our force redirection. But again, you can see here in our second phase, even though force redirection is our emphasis, it's not exclusive. So to bring this back to our force absorption concepts, in that second phase, I'm emphasizing my force redirection, but I'm still working, as you can see here by this box filled in, which is our force absorption principles. Also our force production principles as well. So again, always working all different parts of our training and our athleticism training concepts. We just emphasize one in each phase. So the second phase, I like to emphasize that those force redirection principles, again, about 60 to 70%, and then the remaining 30 to 40% is broken up between our force absorption and our force production. And then that third phase, so our last mesocycle in our overall macro cycle, we are emphasizing our force production principles, as you can see here, and then again 60 to 70% emphasized with our force production, and then the remaining 30 to 40% being split between our force absorption and our force redirection. Okay, so again, the main takeaway of this video for today is how to incorporate these concepts all thrown into one. We'll go into more detail as we move forward too about further ways to program, but the main point is I wanted to get is that we want to emphasize different training concepts based on what phase we're in, but we don't want it to be exclusive. Okay, we always want to be working, like I said, multiple parts of our athleticism, multiple concepts of training. But the key is we want to emphasize different parts. And when it comes to our triphasic training, which is kind of how we can view this 30 days of 4 series, we start in that first phase. We emphasize 60 to 70% emphasize that force absorption. After that, in our second phase, we emphasize our force redirection. And then in our third phase, we emphasize that force production. Although even while emphasizing certain aspects, certain concepts, still working, the full spectrum of training. Okay. So hopefully that all makes sense. Like I said, lots of complex topics when it comes to programming and periodization. There is no perfect training program or training template out there, but there are definitely ones that have been proven to work. Triphasic training, like I said, I subscribe to it. I think it makes a lot of sense when you kind of sit down and think about it. If you didn't get a chance, I strongly suggest take a look back at video 1, go down to the description and take a look at the triphasic training book that is Cal Dietz has put out there, explaining a lot of his concepts and explaining kind of the finer details of it. All right, so that'll do it for day 7. Stay tuned for day 8. A couple more days of talking about force absorption before we switch gears a little bit and then start to talk about our second aspect of force, which is our force redirection.